Jack's footsteps echoed against the cracked asphalt, blending with the faint whistle of the wind sweeping over the vast fields. It was the end of another long day at the auto repair shop in the small town. With his backpack slung over one shoulder, he adjusted its weight as he trudged along the lonely road home. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, when something ahead made him stop. There, near the edge of the deserted road, lay a man. His clothes, a dark suit that seemed expensive, were smeared with dust and blood. Jack hesitated. His heart pounded as his mind wrestled between caution and the instinct to help. "Hey, sir, are you okay?" His voice carried into the quiet, unanswered. The man stirred slightly, letting out a faint, almost inaudible groan. Jack glanced around, hoping to see another car or someone nearby who could help, but the road was empty. Taking cautious steps forward, he noticed the man's face. Deep gashes marked his forehead, and his eyes were half closed, as if he were fighting to stay conscious. "Hang on, I'll help you," Jack murmured, crouching beside the man. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the dry dust of the road churned his stomach, but he swallowed the discomfort. "Can you move?" A weak moan was the only reply. Jack looked around again, fear creeping into his chest. He didn't know if this man was a victim of an accident or something worse, but he couldn't just leave him there. Jack set his backpack down and placed it under the man's head for support. His heart raced, but he tried to appear calm. With trembling hands, he pulled his phone from his pocket, only to find that the signal was barely existent in the isolated area. "Damn it," he muttered, glancing at the man. His lips were pale, and his breathing was shallow. Time was running out. "I'm going to get you out of here, all right? Stay with me," he said, unsure if the man could hear him. Wrapping his arms around the man's torso, Jack began to pull him. Though the man was lean, his dead weight made the task nearly impossible. Each step was a struggle as Jack dragged him toward the shade of a nearby tree, away from the edge of the road. Once there, Jack sat down for a moment to catch his breath, his eyes fixed on the stranger. Despite his injuries, the man's appearance spoke of status: a perfectly tailored suit, a gleaming watch on his wrist. "What's a guy like you doing out here alone?" Jack muttered, his question hanging in the air, unanswered. The sunlight was fading fast, replaced by the faint shimmer of the first stars. The air grew cooler, and Jack knew he had to act quickly. He rummaged through his backpack, looking for anything that might help. He found a water bottle, some tools, and a clean cloth he often carried at work. Carefully, he cleaned the superficial cuts on the man's face. "This might sting a little, but you'll be okay," he said, as if his words could offer some comfort. Despite his fear, something drove him to keep going. Jack couldn't just turn his back. "Water, please." The man's raspy voice broke the silence. Jack's eyes widened, surprised to hear him speak. "Here, drink slowly," he said, helping the stranger take a few sips. He noticed the man's eyes finally beginning to focus. "Who are you?" The man tried to ask, but a cough interrupted him. "I'm Jack. I work in town at a repair shop." "You're hurt. Looks like you had an accident or something," Jack explained, glancing around again, still hoping for some sign of help. The distant sound of an approaching car made Jack's heart leap. He ran to the middle of the road, waving his arms. The headlights illuminated his figure, and the vehicle slowed, stopping a few meters away. A man and a woman stepped out, their faces etched with concern. "What's going on here?" the man asked, frowning as he noticed the injured figure under the tree. "I found this guy on the road. He's in bad shape. I need help getting him to a hospital," Jack explained hurriedly. The woman looked at the injured man and shook her head. "We need to take him now. He won't last much longer here." With combined effort, they managed to lift the man into the back seat of the car. Jack hesitated for a moment, but decided to climb in as well. "I'm coming with you. I want to make sure he's okay." The car cut through the darkness of the road, and Jack stared out the window, lost in thought. Who was this man? What had happened to him? Despite his questions, he knew he had done the right thing. As the hospital came into view on the horizon, Jack took a deep breath. This was only the beginning of something much bigger, though he couldn't know it yet. Fate had crossed their paths in the most unexpected way, and the secrets that would unfold would change their lives forever. Jack paced nervously in the brightly lit hospital waiting room. The sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint hum of medical equipment around him. His hands were still stained with traces of dust and dried blood from carrying the injured man. He had stayed by the stranger's side during the ride, watching helplessly as the man slipped in and out of consciousness. The doctor emerged, pulling down his mask and approaching Jack. "He's stable for now," he said, his tone calm but measured. "You did the right thing bringing him here when you did. Any later, and it might have been too late." Jack let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. "That's good. But who is he? Did he have any ID?" The doctor shook his head. "No ID. Nothing to tell us who he is. He's suffering from temporary amnesia, most likely from the head trauma. He might not even remember his own name." Jack furrowed his brow, the words sinking in. "He doesn't remember anything? How will we know if someone's looking for him?" "Time will tell," the doctor replied, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "For now, he needs rest." Later that night, Jack sat at the man's bedside, watching his shallow breaths. Bandages covered most of his face, and N4 dripped steadily into his arm. Jack found himself studying the stranger's features' sharp jawline, neatly trimmed hair that seemed oddly out of place in its disheveled state. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, but now he lay vulnerable and utterly unguarded. "Why do I feel like I know you?" Jack muttered to himself. Shaking his head, he leaned back in the uncomfortable hospital chair, debating whether to leave. After all, he had done his part, but something kept him rooted there, a pull he couldn't explain. The next morning, the man stirred. His eyes fluttered open, scanning the room with confusion. He winced, raising a hand to his head, only to find it bandaged. "You're awake," Jack said, straightening in his chair. "How do you feel?" The man blinked at him, his voice hoarse. I don't know. Do you remember anything? Your name? What happened?" Jack leaned forward, his tone gentle but curious. The man shook his head slowly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Nothing. It's all blank." Jack hesitated before speaking. "I found you on the side of the road last night. You were in pretty bad shape. Do you have any idea how you got there?" "No," the man whispered. "It's like trying to grab smoke. Every time I reach for it, it disappears." Jack nodded, choosing his next words carefully. "The doctors said it might take time, but someone will come looking for you, right? Family? Friends?" For a moment, the man's expression darkened, as if the very thought of someone finding him stirred unease. "Maybe," he said quietly, though his tone lacked conviction. As the hours passed, Jack stayed, running errands for the nurses, and occasionally bringing water or food to the man, who still struggled to sit up on his own. Slowly, bits of conversation flowed between them, but the man's memory remained a void. "You really didn't have to stay," the man said at one point, his tone tinged with both gratitude and confusion. Jack shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I figured someone should, you know. Until your people find you." The man's gaze lingered on Jack, as if trying to piece together the puzzle of why a stranger would go to such lengths for him. "Thank you," he said simply. That night, as Jack was preparing to leave, the man spoke again, his voice stronger this time. "If I don't remember who I am, what happens then?" Jack paused, turning back to face him. "Then I guess you start over. Build something new." The words hung in the air, resonating more deeply than either of them expected. Jack left the hospital with the faint feeling that this was far from the end of their story. The hospital cafeteria was quiet, the faint murmur of conversations blending with the soft clinking of cutlery. Jack sat at a corner table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, untouched. His thoughts wandered back to the man in the hospital bed upstairs. He couldn't shake the strange pull he felt toward him, a mix of curiosity and something deeper, a need to understand. "Hey, you okay?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was a nurse, a kind woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and a warm smile. Jack nodded, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, just thinking," he replied. Looking back at the cup, she sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. You've been here all night. Most people would have left after calling for help. Jack shrugged. Didn't feel right to just walk away. I mean, what if it were me? Wouldn't I want someone to stay? The nurse tilted her head, studying him. You're a good kid. Not many would do what you did. Her words stirred something in Jack, a mix of pride and sadness. He thought of his family, of the small, tight-knit community where he grew up. They had always taught him to look out for others, even when times were hard. Later, Jack wandered into the hospital courtyard. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the benches and flower beds. He found a quiet spot under a tree and sat, pulling out his phone. A text message blinked on the screen, from a number he hadn't contacted in months. Hope you're doing okay. We miss you. His chest tightened. It was from his younger sister, Emily. He stared at the message, debating whether to reply. Their hometown, nestled in the middle of nowhere, was a place he had left behind to chase a better future. But better wasn't always easier. Memories flooded back, helping his father repair roofs after storms, his mother baking pies to sell at the farmer's market, and Emily running through the fields, laughing as if the world were perfect. Then came the drought, the debt, and the quiet despair that crept into their lives. Jack had left, hoping to find a way to help them, but he hadn't returned as quickly as he'd promised. The man upstairs, Richard, had stirred something in Jack. His presence, his vulnerability, reminded Jack of the countless others who had struggled in his community. The lack of a decent hospital, the crumbling schools, the forgotten roads, they had shaped Jack's determination to work harder, to save more, to one day return and make a difference. As he sat under the tree, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approach. It was the nurse again, holding a paper bag. You should eat, she said, handing it to him. And don't tell me you're not hungry. I've seen your type before, always putting everyone else first. Jack smiled, taking the bag. Thanks. As he opened it, the nurse spoke again. You know, there's a lot of talk about building a clinic out near the countryside, but they say there's no money, no interest. Jack looked up. A clinic? Yeah, she said, sitting beside him. A lot of people out there could use one. But it's always the same story. Money's tight. Priorities are elsewhere. Her words stayed with him long after she left. Jack looked at the hospital building, his mind racing. He didn't know who Richard Hale really was or what had led him to that road. But maybe, just maybe, their meeting wasn't a coincidence. That evening, Jack returned to Richard's room. The man was awake, propped up slightly on the pillows. His eyes followed Jack as he entered. You stayed, Richard said, his voice still weak but steadier than before. Jack nodded, pulling the chair closer. I guess I'm just stubborn like that. Richard smirked faintly. You don't seem the type to stick your neck out for strangers. Jack shrugged. Maybe you remind me of someone. Richard's gaze sharpened slightly, but he said nothing. Jack leaned back in his chair, looking at the bandaged man before him. When you're better, you should visit where I grew up. It's a small place, but there's something special about it. Why? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Because people there don't give up, even when everything's stacked against them. They don't have much, but they take care of each other. It's not perfect, but it's home. For the first time, Richard's expression softened, a flicker of something unspoken crossing his face. Jack didn't push further. Instead, he sat quietly, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. Richard Hale sat upright in the hospital bed, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket. The sterile hum of the medical equipment provided a monotonous backdrop to his fragmented thoughts. The amnesia clouding his mind was both a curse and a shield. He couldn't remember his past, but he couldn't escape the sense that he was running from something. Across the room, Jack leaned against the windowsill, his arms crossed. The two had fallen into a strange rhythm of quiet companionship. Jack watched as Richard absently traced the bandages on his arm, his gaze distant. Anything coming back? Jack finally asked, breaking the silence. Richard shook his head. Flashes, maybe. Nothing clear. What kind of flashes? Jack pressed gently. Curiosity piqued. Richard closed his eyes, trying to pull the fragments into focus. A meeting. A room full of people. Angry voices. Someone shouting my name. He paused, his brow furrowing. And then, headlights. Bright, blinding headlights. I think I was in a car. Jack straightened. An accident? Richard nodded slowly, though uncertainty lingered in his expression. But it doesn't feel random. It's like someone wanted me there. Later that day, Jack wandered the hospital halls, his thoughts spinning. Richard's words had planted a seed of doubt, one that grew with every passing moment. He found himself piecing together the little clues: the expensive suit, the lack of ID, the mysterious injuries, and wondering if the man upstairs was more than just an unfortunate stranger. Back in the room, Richard stared out the window, his reflection ghosting in the glass. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the fading light stirring something in him. A sharp pang of memory struck, voices raised in a heated argument, a hand slamming against a table, and the phrase, "You'll regret this." He gripped the edge of the windowsill, his breathing uneven. The words echoed in his mind, their menace chilling. Who had said them? And why? Jack returned to the room to find Richard standing unsteadily by the window. "Hey, you shouldn't be up," he said, rushing to steady him. Richard glanced at him, his expression haunted. "It wasn't an accident, Jack. Someone wanted me dead." Jack froze, his grip tightening on Richard's arm. "Are you sure?" Richard nodded, sinking back onto the bed. "I can't prove it, but I remember someone threatening me. I don't know who, but I was warned." Jack sat beside him, his mind racing. "Why would anyone want to hurt you?" Richard sighed, frustration lacing his tone. "I don't know. I don't even know who I am." As the evening stretched on, Jack and Richard began piecing together what little they knew. Jack asked about the meeting Richard had mentioned, pressing for any detail he could recall. "There were papers," Richard said slowly. "Documents. Something about shares? Investments?" It felt important. Jack frowned. "You think it's connected to whoever tried to hurt you?" "Probably," Richard replied, rubbing his temples. "But without my memory, I can't be sure." Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the mystery settling between them. "We'll figure it out. Someone will come looking for you eventually, and maybe they'll have answers, or lies," Richard muttered under his breath. That night, as Richard drifted into a restless sleep, the flashes returned, this time clearer, more vivid. He saw a face, familiar yet elusive, twisted in anger. A voice, low and venomous, said, "You'll never escape us, Hale." He woke with a start, gasping for air. The room was dark, the faint glow of the city lights seeping through the blinds. Jack stirred in the chair beside him, half asleep, but alert enough to notice Richard's distress. "Another memory?" Jack asked, his voice groggy. Richard nodded, his eyes wide. "A name. Hale. That's my name." Jack blinked, suddenly awake. "Richard Hale," he said slowly, testing the name. "That's something at least." Richard leaned back against the pillows, his chest rising and falling heavily. "It doesn't explain who tried to kill me, but it's a start." The following morning, the hospital felt different. Richard, though still weak, had a clearer presence of mind. Jack entered the room with a cup of coffee and a cautious smile, unsure of how much progress Richard had made overnight. "I remember more," Richard said abruptly, cutting through the silence. Jack set the coffee on the bedside table. "What do you mean?" Richard's fingers traced the edge of the blanket. "Hale Holdings. It's a company. My company. And someone didn't want me to run it anymore." Jack's eyebrows shot up. "You own a company?" "Not just any company," Richard murmured, his voice carrying a weight that Jack couldn't yet comprehend. "It's big, important, and dangerous in the wrong hands." Over the next few hours, Richard shared fragmented memories, each piece painting a clearer picture. A boardroom meeting filled with tension, a contract that could shift power, and the unmistakable feeling of betrayal from someone close. Jack listened, piecing together the clues. "So, someone sabotaged your car to get you out of the way?" Richard nodded, his face grim. "That's what it feels like. But I don't know who." Jack leaned forward, his tone steady. "Then we figure it out together." Richard studied him for a moment. Why are you doing this? Jack, you don't owe me anything. Jack shrugged, his smile faint. Maybe I just want to see how this ends. Richard chuckled softly, though his expression remained solemn. You're a rare one. As the afternoon stretched on, Richard began to regain some strength. He pulled Jack into deeper conversations, learning more about the young man's life and struggles. Your town sounds remarkable, Richard said, after Jack recounted the resilience of his community. To thrive with so little, it's inspiring. Jack smiled, but there was a tinge of sadness in his expression. It's not thriving, it's surviving. And barely, for a moment, Richard said nothing. Then, his gaze softened. You've helped me when no one else would. I'll make sure I return the favor. You don't have to, Jack replied. I didn't do this for a reward. That's exactly why I will, Richard said firmly. As the day faded, Richard fell into a light sleep, while Jack sat beside him, lost in thought. The mysteries surrounding the man's life were beginning to take shape, but the answers felt as distant as ever. And yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that helping Richard might lead to something greater, not just for him, but for everyone he cared about. It was nearing dusk when two men in suits entered the hospital lobby. Their polished shoes clacked against the tiles, and their sharp eyes scanned the room with precision. Jack noticed them immediately from the hallway. They exuded authority, their postures rigid and purposeful. The taller of the two approached the nurse's station. We're here to see Richard Hale, he said in a clipped tone, flashing a badge that glinted in the fluorescent light. Jack's stomach twisted. He hurried back to Richard's room, his mind racing. The men didn't look like ordinary visitors. Their presence felt too calculated, too official. Bursting through the door, he found Richard sitting up, flipping through a magazine. We've got company, Jack said, his voice low. Richard raised an eyebrow. What kind of company? Men in suits. Said they're here to see you. Jack hesitated. They don't look friendly. Moments later, the door swung open, and the two men stepped inside. Their eyes locked onto Richard, as if assessing every detail. The taller one, who seemed to lead the pair, spoke first. Mr. Hale, good to see you alive. Richard's expression hardened. Who are you? We're your security detail. Sent by Hale Holding, the man replied smoothly. Your disappearance caused quite a stir. Richard's eyes narrowed. Disappearance? I was nearly killed. Where were you then? The man didn't flinch. That's what we're here to figure out. Your car was sabotaged, and your whereabouts have been a mystery for days. We've been working to ensure your safety and uncover who's behind this. Jack crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. Why should he trust you now? The second man, who had remained silent until then, spoke. Because without us, Mr. Hale's life is still in danger. Richard leaned back against the pillows, his mind churning. The flashes of memory were clearer now. Board meetings, heated discussions, a looming threat. Who did this? He asked finally, his voice steady but cold. The lead security officer hesitated before replying. We believe it's someone within Hale Holdings. Someone with a vested interest in seeing you removed. Richard clenched his jaw. Who? The man shook his head. We have our suspicions, but nothing concrete. That's why you need to come with us. It's not safe here. Jack stepped forward, his voice firm. And what happens to him after that? You just whisk him away without answers. Richard raised a hand, silencing Jack. No, if I leave, it's on my terms, and I want Jack with me. Both men exchanged glances, clearly displeased. That's highly irregular, the lead officer said. But it's your call, Mr. Hale. As the men left the room to make arrangements, Jack turned to Richard, disbelief etched across his face. You want me to go with you? Why? Richard smirked faintly. Because I trust you more than I trust them. And because I have a feeling you'll help me figure out who's trying to kill me. Jack shook his head, exhaling slowly. This is way out of my league, maybe, Richard admitted. But you've stuck with me this far. What's a little more danger? Jack couldn't help but laugh, though his nerves were fraying. You've got a strange way of saying thank you. I mean it, Richard said, his tone softening. You saved my life. Now I need your help to take it back. The air outside the hospital was brisk as Richard and Jack exited through the main doors, flanked by the two security agents. A sleek black car waited at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights. Jack hesitated, his instincts screaming that stepping into this world of wealth and power was a mistake. But Richard's unwavering gaze urged him forward. "You can still back out," Richard said quietly, leaning closer to Jack. "No hard feelings." Jack shook his head. "If I was going to back out, it would have been long before now." The ride to Richard's estate was tense. Jack sat in the back seat, his arms crossed, listening as the lead security officer briefed Richard on the situation. "We've tightened security at the mansion and isolated the staff. No one gets in or out without clearance." "And the board?" Richard asked, his tone sharp. "They're restless," the officer replied. "Your absence has stirred factions. Some are trying to consolidate power." Richard's jaw tightened, his mind already spinning with strategies. Jack watched him, trying to reconcile the man in the hospital bed with the one now exuding authority. The mansion loomed ahead, its sprawling grounds shrouded in darkness, save for the floodlights illuminating the entrance. As the car rolled up the driveway, Jack couldn't hide his amazement. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming: marble columns, intricately landscaped gardens, and a fountain that sparkled under the moonlight. Richard stepped out first, his posture steady despite his injuries. "Welcome to my home," he said, glancing at Jack. "It's not as peaceful as it looks." Jack followed, his unease growing as they entered the mansion. The interior was equally opulent: polished floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with expensive art. Yet the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. The staff stood in clusters, their expressions tense, their whispers barely audible as Richard passed. Richard led Jack to his study, dismissing the security team with a wave of his hand. The room was a blend of sophistication and utility, lined with bookshelves and a massive desk dominating the center. Richard sat heavily in the leather chair, gesturing for Jack to take the seat opposite him. "I need to confront them," Richard said, his voice firm. "The people who did this. They won't stop until they've taken everything." "And you think they're here, in your company?" Jack asked. Richard nodded. "It's the only thing that makes sense. Someone on the inside orchestrated this. They've been waiting for an opportunity to strike." Jack leaned forward. "How do you plan to prove it?" Richard's eyes flicked to a locked drawer in his desk. "There's evidence. Documents that could implicate them. But getting to it won't be easy." Jack frowned. "Why not?" "Because I hid it," Richard admitted. "I didn't trust anyone, not even my security team. If they find it first, I'm finished." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young woman, part of the security staff, stepped in cautiously. "Mr. Hale, there's been a breach in the outer grounds." Richard tensed. "How serious?" "We're investigating," she replied. "But I thought you'd want to know." Richard exchanged a look with Jack, his expression grim. "It's starting." "What's starting?" Jack asked. "The endgame," Richard said, rising from his chair. "They're here, and they're not going to stop until they get what they came for." Jack stood as well, his nerves tightening. "So, what's the plan?" Richard smirked faintly. "We fight back." The tension in the air was palpable as Richard and Jack entered the mansion's expansive dining hall. The room, typically reserved for lavish events, now served as the meeting ground for a confrontation long overdue. Around the table sat several members of Hale Holdings' board, their faces a mix of feigned concern and thinly veiled animosity. Richard's entrance commanded immediate attention. Dressed sharply, with only the faint bandages on his face hinting at his recent ordeal, he exuded a sense of control that belied the storm brewing inside him. Jack followed closely, his casual attire starkly contrasting with the tailored suits, but his quiet confidence lent him an unspoken authority. "Richard," a woman at the head of the table said, her tone carefully measured. "We've been worried about you." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you have, Claire, especially considering my recent accident." A murmur rippled through the group, but Claire maintained her composure. "We're glad you're back. The company needs stability, especially now." "Stability?" Richard echoed, his voice sharp. "That's an interesting choice of words, considering someone in this room tried to kill me." The accusation landed like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Faces turned pale, eyes darting nervously. Jack stood slightly behind Richard, his eyes scanning the room, watching for the smallest reaction. "This is absurd," a man to Claire's right scoffed. "You can't just walk in here and throw around accusations without proof." Richard stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. "Oh, I have proof. It's just a matter of finding it. But I thought I'd give the guilty party a chance to come clean before things get unpleasant." The man leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Bluffing won't get you anywhere, Richard." Jack's voice cut through the tension. "Maybe not. But you seem awfully defensive for someone who claims to be innocent." All eyes turned to Jack, and for a moment he felt the weight of their scrutiny. But he stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. Richard moved to the head of the table, taking the seat opposite Claire. "Someone tampered with my car. Someone who stood to gain from my removal. And given the recent power plays within the company, it doesn't take a genius to figure out who benefits." Claire's expression tightened, though her voice remained calm. "This is paranoid, Richard. We've been working tirelessly to keep the company afloat in your absence." "Funny," Richard said, leaning forward, "because it seems like some of you have been working tirelessly to ensure I stayed gone." The tension reached its peak when one of the security staff entered the room, carrying a folder. She approached Richard and whispered something in his ear. Richard's eyes flicked to Jack, then back to the group. "Looks like we won't need confessions after all," he said, opening the folder. Inside were copies of emails, financial records, and contracts, each one pointing to a coordinated effort to oust him from the company. The room erupted in chaos. Accusations flew, voices clashing, as Richard calmly flipped through the pages, letting the evidence speak for itself. Jack's eyes caught something, Claire's hand subtly reaching for a phone under the table. Instinct took over. "Don't," Jack barked, lunging forward and snatching the phone before she could act. He held it up, his chest heaving. "What do we have here?" he asked, unlocking the screen with a swipe. The messages were damning plans for the sabotage, communications with hired hands, and instructions to ensure Richard never returned. Claire's facade crumbled, her mask of calm replaced by panic. "You have no idea what you're doing," she hissed. "I think we do," Jack said, tossing the phone to Richard. Richard stood, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel. "Call the authorities." "It's over." The room fell silent as security escorted Claire and her co-conspirators out. Jack watched as Richard leaned against the table, the weight of victory mingling with exhaustion. "You did it," Jack said quietly. Richard looked at him, a faint smile breaking through. "We did it." The mansion was quiet in the early hours of the morning. The echoes of the previous night's confrontation had dissipated, leaving an air of tentative calm. Richard stood on the balcony of his study, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The city stretched before him, the first rays of sunlight piercing the skyline. But his thoughts were far from the view. Behind him, Jack entered the room. "You're up early," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Richard turned, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about." Jack stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You should be proud. You fought back, and you won." Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Winning doesn't feel the way I thought it would." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've spent my whole life building this empire," Richard said, gesturing toward the city. "But last night made me realize something. None of it matters if you don't have people you can trust." The two men sat across from each other in the study, the morning light filtering through the curtains. Richard took a deep breath, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You didn't have to stay," Richard said, breaking the silence. "From the moment you found me, you could have walked away. But you didn't." "Why?" Jack hesitated, searching for the right words. "I guess I saw something in you. A chance to do something right. And maybe a chance to make a difference." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing Jack's words. "You did more than make a difference. You saved my life." Jack smiled faintly. "Well, you've got it back now. What are you going to do with it?" Richard rose from his chair, walking to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it, revealing a stack of files. Pulling one out, he handed it to Jack. Jack opened the file, his eyes scanning the contents. Blueprints, budgets, and plans for a project titled the Hale Foundation Community Hospital. "What is this?" Jack asked, his voice filled with surprise. "It's a promise," Richard replied. "A promise to use what I have to give back. Your town, it inspired me. People like you, people who fight for what's right, they deserve more." Jack stared at the file, his emotions wavering between disbelief and gratitude. "You're serious about this?" "Completely," Richard said firmly. "And I want you to help me make it happen." Later that day, Richard called a press conference in the mansion's courtyard. Journalists gathered, cameras flashing as he stepped onto the podium. Jack stood to the side, feeling out of place amidst the formal chaos. Richard addressed the crowd, his voice carrying a mix of authority and sincerity. He spoke of his ordeal, the betrayal within his company, and the lessons he'd learned. But the climax of his speech came when he announced the hospital project. "This isn't just about me," Richard said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "This is about using what I have to lift others up, starting with the people who taught me the value of resilience and compassion." The applause was thunderous. And for the first time, Jack felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Months later, the small town that Jack once called home buzzed with excitement. The once empty plot of land on the outskirts had transformed into a state-of-the-art community hospital. Its modern design stood out against the surrounding countryside, a beacon of hope for the people who had long struggled without proper health care. The inauguration ceremony was modest but heartfelt. Locals gathered, their faces lit with anticipation and gratitude. Children ran through the grassy fields nearby, while older residents stood in small groups, sharing stories of their hardships and the hope that this new facility represented. Jack stood near the entrance, adjusting the collar of his shirt. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but today was different. This was the culmination of months of work, planning, and determination. And though he tried to blend into the crowd, his efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Richard approached, his presence as commanding as ever. Dressed in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the philanthropist he had become. But his smile was genuine, a rare softness in his otherwise sharp demeanor. "Nervous?" Richard asked, clapping a hand on Jack's shoulder. Jack smirked. "A little. Not every day you get to cut the ribbon on a hospital," Richard chuckled. "You've earned it." As the ceremony began, Richard took the stage, speaking to the crowd with the same passion that had fueled the project from the start. He spoke of resilience, community, and the importance of giving back. But when it came time to acknowledge the people who had made it possible, he turned to Jack. "This hospital isn't just a building," Richard said, his voice resonating through the crowd. "It's a symbol of what can happen when we come together. And it wouldn't exist without one man's determination to make a difference. Jack, would you join me?" The crowd erupted in applause as Jack hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. Slowly, he stepped onto the stage, shaking Richard's hand before taking the oversized scissors handed to him. Together, they cut the ribbon, the crowd cheering as the doors of the hospital opened for the first time. After the ceremony, Jack wandered through the hospital's pristine halls, marveling at the transformation. Each room was filled with new equipment, a stark contrast to the dilapidated facilities he remembered from his youth. Nurses and doctors moved efficiently, their presence a sign of the change this place would bring. Richard joined him, hands in his pockets, as he surveyed the scene. "What do you think?" Jack smiled, his expression filled with pride. "I think we did something good," Richard nodded. "This is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do." Jack glanced at him, his gratitude clear. "I never thought I'd see something like this in my lifetime, let alone be a part of it." "You didn't just see it," Richard said. "You made it happen." As the sun set over the town, Jack stood outside the hospital, watching as the lights inside began to glow. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the chance encounter on a deserted road, the mystery, the danger, and ultimately, the trust that had formed between him and Richard. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a legacy, a testament to what could be achieved when compassion and determination met opportunity. And for Jack, it was a new beginning. What lesson did this incredible story bring to you? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to Golden Story and leave a like. Each story we create takes time, care, and a lot of dedication to touch the hearts of viewers like you. Your support inspires us to keep bringing you more special content. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next heartfelt story.